draw your attention to the front here. We're about ready to get going, and this is our semi-annual symposium, and there'll be a number of people that are watching online or will be watching at a later date, and so some of you are taking this as for some extra credit points for the philosophy class and Old Testament survey class. Those one-page summaries with a query will be due next Wednesday. So you've got some time to reflect and can interview our presenters tonight. So with that, I'd like to begin and introduce the Robert Barclay Symposium. Actually began was approved by our faculty back in March of 2016. And our presenters, the first symposium was in February of 2017, almost 1 year after we approved the movement forward of the Robert Barclay Institute. So since then, we've had a presenter each fall and each spring semester. So tonight, our presenter is Dr. Glenn Leppert, and I'm going to give you some background on Dr. Glenn, and then we'll give some background on the responder, Gene Pickard. So Dr. Glenn Leppert was born in Boise, Idaho, and lived on a dairy farm, which also raised purebred spotted Poland China hogs. So dairy to hogs. While in high school, Glenn helped establish a Youth for Christ chapter at the high school, and with his sister taught several Sunday school classes for Mexican farm workers in the area. He was graduated with a BA degree from Northwest Nazarene University in secondary education, English and history, after doing a full-year internship teaching English at a junior high school in Utah. Following graduation from college, he and his wife, Sue, spent 3 years in a remote school in Nigeria, West Africa, as teachers, and Glenn also served as principal before returning to the States to do an MAR in religion from George Fox University Seminary. Glenn directed an inner-city education program for 5 years in the inner city of Portland before becoming a pastor at a Friends church in Salem, Oregon. While in Oregon, Glenn was a counselor at a local elementary school and taught a large child evangelism class at that time. He came to Barclay College in 1985. I will say I was still a student here then, or was a student, and earned an MA in history from Fort Hays State University, doing his first 2 years at the college. He received a PhD in history from Kansas State University 2003, while continuing as full-time registrar and instructor. Glenn has written several textbooks that have been used in classes, including one for historical books and a study guide for Romans. His favorite textbook is the current text for our New Testament Greek classes at Barclay College, called Using New Testament Greek. Glenn wrote the chapter on Barclay College for the book Founded by Friends. He has presented several papers to various groups, including the Kansas State History Teachers Association and at the Eisenhower Library in Abilene, Kansas. And I might add, the Eisenhower Library would still love for Glenn to move close to them so that he could present with people who would tour the library. He also wrote for Kansas and People to People in Kansas City. He presented a paper on the Civil War at the Barclay College Spring 2018 colloquium, and recently a paper on the transition for the Congress of the Confederation to the Congress of the United States in observation of Constitution Day at Barclay College. Following Glenn's presentation this evening on virtue and a more perfect union, Gene Pickard will be responding. Gene Pickard grew up in Salem, Iowa, home of the oldest Friends church west of the Mississippi, the first frontier college, and the westernmost station of the Underground Railroad. There, Glenn attended the Salem Friends Church, where he committed his life to Christ and received the call to ministry and missions. He graduated from Mount Pleasant High School there in Iowa in 1969, was graduated with a BA from Friends Bible College, now Barclay College. After graduating from college, Gene ministered for 3 years in teaching at San Antonio Friends School. From there, he attended Asbury Theological Seminary, where he was graduated with an MDiv degree in 1975. After graduation, Glenn stayed on at the seminary 1 year to teach Greek. In 1976, Glenn and his wife, Myra, and their 1-year-old daughter traveled to Costa Rica to study Spanish for 1 year in the Institut de Lengua Española in preparation for missionary service in Berea Bible Seminary in Guatemala. In Guatemala, Glenn was under the auspices of Evangelical Friends Church Southwest. He taught in the Berea Seminary in Guatemala during 3 different periods for a total of 16 years. Sandwiched between these times, he taught twice here at Barclay College. From 1982 to 1986 and 1994 to 1996, mostly in the area of missions. Meanwhile, while teaching full-time at Barclay College during the first period, he completed a Doctor of Missiology degree from Trinity Evangelical Divinity School. After leaving Guatemala in 2000, he was the director and one of the teachers for 17 years at the Bible Institute for Institute Leadership Development, a ministry of Evangelical Friends Church Southwest. In 2017, he mostly retired and moved back to Haviland, Kansas. Gene continues to teach a couple of adjunct classes online in the master's program at Barclay. So after Glenn presents, Gene will respond, and then after that, part of what makes this a symposium and a continuing learning experience is you can form questions that you would like to pose to Glenn or Gene following that as we continue the dialogue on the topic of virtue and a more perfect.
At Fort Hays State University. Other times I was able to access them from the internet. I also read through George Fox's journal under 2 different editions, the Rufus Jones as well as the Nichols, to try to get a good picture of what was happening in the Friends world. And then I found online a number of other journals from Friends from the early period of time. So, virtue and a more perfect union. On October 20, 1774, the First Continental Congress adopted the Articles of Association in response to what the colonies called the intolerable acts that had been imposed upon them. These Articles of Association proposed a boycott on the import and export of goods to and from Britain. It also spelled out a number of actions that would be taken by the colonists to ensure not only the success of the boycott, but also an attempt to bring a sense of unity and strength to the people in the colonies. Representatives met in Philadelphia in September 1774, forming the First Continental Congress. The first 2 actions of that Congress are, I believe, significant and form the form of my presentation this evening. The very first action, taken on September 6, 1774, was acceptance of a resolution to open the session with prayer. The value of prayer and the fact that the sessions that followed were opened with prayer are noted both in the journals of the Continental Congress and in the 8 volumes of the letters of members from the Continental Congress. The second action was to compose a set of articles defining what became known as the Articles of Association of the Congress, and sometimes referred to as the American Association. Being careful not to criticize the king, but to express their unhappiness at the current state of affairs, the Congress considered a proposal by Joseph Galloway of Pennsylvania and composed a document that announced a ban on the slave trade, severance of all economic ties with Britain, and the desire to improve agriculture and industry within the colonies, as well as to provide produce for colonists at a reasonable price. But more importantly, the document also spelled out a way for the colonists to build for themselves character that would give them a more perfect union and strengthen them in their stand against Britain. Several years ago, I came across a book titled Toward a More Perfect Union, Virtue and the Formation of American Republics by Anne Fairfax Withington, and I was struck by her statement. She wrote in October of 1774, Congress passed a moral code which banned the theater, cockfights, and horse races, and in abiding by this code, Americans built for themselves a character as a virtuous people which set them apart from the corrupt British, prepared them to declare independence, and gave them the confidence to establish republican governments. Withington's argument was that this moral program, grounded in popular culture, was a strategy to involve people emotionally in the cause and to broaden the reach of resistance to include all classes and all genders. When the Congress thought about what kind of people they wanted to be and how they should behave in order to realize that ideal, they decided to give up certain distracting vices. The delegates had to create an intercolonial morality that would draw people from all colonies together in resistance. I was intrigued with the idea that the virtue could be engendered by such an action, and that virtue would lead to character that would make a more perfect union of the colonies. I sought out the text of the document and wondered if the committee that brought Galloway's proposal to the Congress could be identified as people of virtue. Specifically, I wondered if they were Quakers. And although I found the names of the men on that committee, I have had no way yet to ascertain if they were Friends. Joseph Galloway, the one who proposed the articles, did have a Quaker background and is often described as being affiliated with the Quakers. There were 14 articles altogether, and while most of those relate to the non-importation of British goods, there were several that focused on the way the colonists would conduct themselves during the boycott. Each article of this nature was designed to achieve unity and a sense of being an independent people. My concern is with article number 8, which read, "We, in our several stations, encourage frugality, economy, and industry, and promote agriculture, arts, and the manufactures of this country, especially that of wool, and will discountenance and discourage every species of extravagance and dissipation, especially all horse racing and all kinds of gaming, cockfighting, exhibition of shows, plays, and other expensive diversions and entertainments, and on the death of any relation or friend, none of us or any of our families will go into any further mourning dress than a black crape or ribbon on the arm for hat for gentlemen, and a black ribbon and necklace for ladies, and we will discontinue the giving of gloves and scarves at funerals." A little research indicated to me that the culture of the colonies just prior to the creation of the association was often described as just like England. Nothing set the colonies apart from the mother country culturally. Outside of the Puritan attempt to inculcate virtue in New England, there was no colony-wide virtue that integrated all of the people. By definition, virtue is behavior showing high moral standards, moral excellence, integrity, beneficial behavior, strength, and courage are all elements of virtue. Conformity to a standard of right and wrong is a part of virtue. Often concepts such as frugality, hard work, honesty, and faithfulness are considered virtuous as well. Virtue is an important aspect of forming cohesiveness among people. Withington, in her book, believed that it was virtue that would make possible a republican form of government, which would demand the participation of the people. She noted that the colonies were not virtuous enough to make the leap to republicanism in 1774, but the discipline of the bands created enough virtue that that leap could be made in 1776. Banning plays, cockfights, horse races, and fancy funerals helped create virtue. One reason was that each of these could be and were seen as practices that destroyed virtue. As practices, each one had led to excess, and the excess led to privation and weakness. Plays introduced ideas and lifestyles that were damaging. Cockfights and horse races led to excessive gambling and to loss of control and violence, and both created shame and poverty. The fancy funerals led to the opposite of frugality. What was wanted was frugality, industry, simple, hard-working lifestyles that would lead to a strong, unified, growing nation. Before there could be a union, the American people needed to have a firm understanding of themselves as a people. They needed to be more in sync with each other, to have a common purpose, a common goal. These things were accomplished by Article 8 because banning these very English activities helped the Americans create virtue through discipline. And even though seemingly trivial, the banning of these activities helped them disassociate from the mother country, gave them a way to identify patriots, allowed them a sense of being a separate, virtuous people, and prepared them for revolution. As men and women disciplined themselves by foregoing these former pleasures, they helped virtue increase. They became stronger. They used what had been squandered on theater passes, bets, gloves, and new clothes to strengthen families. And stronger families made for stronger communities. Stronger communities, in turn, engendered a stronger nation, one eventually strong enough to resist the unfair coercion placed upon it by Britain. But why am I presenting a lesson from the American colonial history for a Robert Barclay Symposium? Where's the Quaker connection? It is first that I wanted to know whether the Congressional Committee was made up of Quakers. If they were Quakers, did they recognize the value of virtue? Secondly, I wanted to explore the concept of virtue in relation to the history of Friends. Was it virtue that gave the cohesiveness to the early Friends movement? Was it their virtue as a people that kept them going when their meetings were broken up, when they found themselves so often hauled into court, and when such a large number of them spent long periods in prison? Was it virtue that enabled those early Friends to speak to the religious confusion that characterized their century? In other words, was it virtue that created the more perfect union among the early Friends? I began looking for what Friends wrote about virtue. I searched for references to virtue in the Journal of George Fox, and although I did not find as many as I had suspected I did find statements by Fox such as, "Do not think that anything will outlast truth, for the truth stands sure, and it's over that which is out of truth. For the good will overcome the evil, the light darkness, the life death, virtue vice, and righteousness unrighteousness." And also in the words of George Fox, "Likewise I was made to warn masters and mistresses, fathers and mothers and private families, to take care that their children and servants be trained up in the fear of the Lord, and that they themselves should be therein examples and patterns of sobriety and virtue in them. And also, they asked me if I would not take up arms for the commonwealth against the king. But I told them I lived in the virtue of that life and power that took away the occasion for all wars. Though the term virtue is not often present in the journal or in the early writings and letters of friends, the reminders of living with high moral standards, integrity, spiritual strength, and courage definitely are. Live the life of the Scriptures. Live and walk in the Spirit of God. Do not live in the power and life of those faults. Walk and live in and follow after the truth, so that in light, in life, and in love you may live. Live and walk soberly in the truth of Christ. Live in the Lord's power and life. Therefore, live in the power of the Lord God. Live in the pure wisdom, counsel, and instruction from God. Live in the power of God. Live in peace in Christ, the way of peace, and therein seek the peace of all men and no man's hurt. Live a peaceable and godly life in all godliness and honesty. And so, dear friends, live in all the peaceable truth and in the love of it, serving the Lord in newness of life. Those encouragements shared so often by George Fox and others of the early Friends preachers helped the movement indeed become a virtuous one. As Friends engaged in the mission of declaring truth to their age, they came to be known as a people of simplicity, honesty, faithfulness, especially to each other. Common core values or virtues soon became associated with Friends. Kim Hayes, in her study, Practicing Virtues, gives 4 central virtues: equality, community, simplicity, and peace. And she contends that equality, community, simplicity, and peace are all chapters in the Quaker story of fostering the inner light in every individual. In a peaceful environment where people feel equal to one another, share a common sense of community, live simply and single-mindedly, it's easier for that of God, or that which is best in every individual, to emerge. Other Friends suggest 6 core virtues: simplicity, peace, integrity, community, equality, and stewardship. Kindness, honesty, service are virtues listed by still others who say virtues are the essence of character. And when we keep the practice of virtues at the heart of everyday life, we live with purpose. Early Friends had purpose. That was to declare truth. They were very mission-minded. But one important aspect of virtue is that virtue needs to be cultivated. Unless practiced consistently, they become dormant. Virtue needs to be habitual in our lives. The virtue produced by the 1774 Association produced sufficient union and strength for the colonists' bid for independence to be successful. The more perfect union that it brought about gave the needed strength and confidence to win a most unlikely victory. Bound together in a common cause, they had come to think of themselves as a people with a will and a character. But sadly, as those original colonies threw off the sovereignty of the king and replaced it with the sovereignty of the people, they also let the newly formed virtues lapse and disappear. Withington concludes her book reporting that in 1783, right after the peace treaty, a traveler in Virginia found folks zealously talking about horse races, runaway slaves, and the latest play. In the late 1780s, horse races were revived in South Carolina, Virginia, Maryland, and New York. By the 1790s, it was thriving. Benjamin Latrobe in 1796 established that 1,500 people attended a horse race in Petersburg, Virginia. Cockfighting returned to Philadelphia in 1793. Theater companies gave plays in Baltimore, New York, and Richmond. In 1789, the Pennsylvania legislature repealed its act outlawing the theater. Withington also reported the austerity of funerals dwindled after the Revolution. Disturbed, in fact, by the burgeoning extravagance, the Massachusetts General Court in 1797 urged the people to return to the regulations of 1774 in order to perpetuate a national badge for mourning dress suitable to the dignity of their independence. Early Friends held tenaciously to the teaching of the centrality of the Spirit, silent waiting upon the Spirit in worship, honesty, diligence in business, use of thee and thou instead of you, the refusal to take oaths and to participate in war, and the participation of women in ministry. They made them a virtuous people able to withstand and persevere through the persecutions of the 17th century and the challenges of the 18th century. To maintain a more perfect union among friends, to keep Friends movement strong enough to address the 21st century, the Friends virtues of simplicity, peace, integrity, community, equality, and stewardship need to be daily habits today for each friend.
Just to be clear, I am Gene and not Glenn. I might say, too, before I start, that if George Fox were alive today, he'd turn over in his grave at our use of doctor, this and that, and other flattering titles. But this is an academic institution, and I'm going to defy George Fox and use those titles. A good paper presents questions that make us think more deeply and ask more questions, to seek more answers. Dr. Leppert's presentation has done just that. The principal question he raises is whether the creation of virtue in a community can lead to a more perfect union. That is, whether the legislation of certain virtues, actually prohibitions rather than virtues in this case, laid out by the First Continental Congress led to a more united effort by the colonies in their struggle against the oppression of Great Britain. The banning of horse racing, cockfighting, theaters, and expensive funerals were meant to curb excessive spending and questionable behaviors. Another question was the role of Friends or Quakers in creating virtue in the colonies. And related to that question was the question of whether virtue gave a cohesiveness to the early Friends movement. The paper raised further questions in my mind. The first is a question that we seldom dare ask lest we be thought to be unpatriotic. Was the Revolutionary War itself justified in light of the scriptural teaching of Romans 13, in which we're instructed to be subject to our ruling authorities? In other words, was the war itself virtuous? I'm not going to dwell on that subject lest I be thought to be less than patriotic. Secondly, to what extent did the first great awakening in the 1730s and the 1740s in Britain, Europe, and the American colonies contribute to the virtues of the colonies and to the creation of a sense of unity before the Revolutionary War? Was this movement more of a factor than the prohibition declared by Congress? Thirdly, how is virtue created? Can it be legislated? Can it be created by prohibitions against harmful behavior? Is legal and right always the same? Is illegal and wrong always the same? Fourthly, do communities determine what is virtuous, or does virtuous behavior form communities? Fifth question I ask is, if, as Professor Leppert suggests, the practice of virtue gave cohesiveness to the early Friends movement and created a more perfect union among them, will it have the same result on a larger scale, on a nation, for instance? And then my last question, Professor Leppert also states, quote, "But one important aspect of virtue is that virtues need to be cultivated. Unless practiced consistently, they become dormant. Virtue needs to be habitual in our lives," unquote. My question is, how are virtues cultivated to prevent them from becoming dormant. Well, it's frustrating to students to only ask questions and not give some attempt to make a response to them. So I will respond briefly to some of the questions I've raised related to the presentation. I've already said I will avoid responding further to the first question. The second question has to do with the influence of the First Great Awakening on the American colonies. It began in the 1730s and continued into the 1740s, some 3 or 4 decades before the Revolutionary War. This Great Awakening led to a revival of religious and spiritual fervor. It emphasized repentance for sin, faith in Christ, and right moral behavior. It's been stated that the Wesleyan Revival, part of the First Great Awakening in Britain, saved Britain from suffering the same convulsions that shook France during the French Revolution. Historians also believe, at least the one I found, that, quote, it helped to hasten the development of political freedom in America and served to draw people together for American independence. It created unity because it was the first major national event that all colonies experienced, unquote. It encouraged equality and fairness and a more democratic way of thinking. So, in my way of thinking, it did more to create virtue and a more perfect union than did the banning of certain questionable behaviors. That leads to the second question of whether virtue can be legislated. Apparently not, for as Dr. Leppert points out, the banned behaviors quickly came back into vogue after the war ended. Closer to our own day, we have seen the failure of prohibition, prohibiting gambling, prohibiting the use of marijuana, and so on. Now, that's not to say that our government or institutions such as Barclay College should allow wrong behavior simply because the disallowance of it does not create virtue in a person. Reining in harmful behavior is essential to the cohesiveness of society. How then can virtue, right behavior, right moral behavior be created in a person? It must come from the transformation of the heart of each individual. The early Quakers stressed moral behavior because they believed Jesus is right here, right now. He is here now to lead his people. A commitment to Jesus transformed them. They wanted to be transformed to his image by the power of his Spirit. And virtue must be cultivated. How? Galatians 5 describes the conflict between the works of the flesh, or sinful nature, and the fruit of the Spirit. Note the virtues of the fruit of the Spirit: love, joy, peace, forbearance, kindness, generosity, fidelity, gentleness, self-control. Galatians 5, verses 22 and 23. These are virtues. Paul goes on to say that these virtues are cultivated by belonging to Christ, living by the Spirit, and being directed by the Spirit. In Philippians 4:8, Paul has these words to say: Finally, brethren, whatsoever things are true, whatsoever things are honorable, whatsoever things are just, whatsoever things are pure, whatsoever things are lovely, whatsoever things of good report, if there be any virtue, if there be any praise, think on these things. In other words, set your mind on them, be transformed in your mind, as he also suggests in Romans chapter 12, verse 2. Dr. Leppert ends his presentation with these words, quote, to maintain a more perfect union among friends, to keep the Friends movement strong enough to address the 21st century, the Friends' virtues of simplicity, peace, integrity, community, equality, and stewardship need to be daily habits today for each friend, unquote. And I might add, that comes from keeping in step with the Spirit of the living God.
I'm going to ask Gene one question, and then I'm going to offer Glenn an opportunity to respond to one of the points. But then from there, we'd like to open this up to any of the questions that you might have. Gene, could you just give just a thumbnail response, a little bit more information on what the Great Awakening consisted of? What was the Great Awakening?
Great Awakening started in the United States with, 1730s. Jonathan Edwards, one of the, considered the greatest theologian that the Americans ever produced. And then on the continental side, with John Wesley, Charles Wesley, and George Whitefield. The Wesleys were very instrumental in a revival in Britain. George Whitefield traveled to the United States and had evangelistic services all over the colonies that continued on into the 40s. And that caused a great awakening. There were camp meetings, there were meetings of repentance and so on that, in my mind, considered that began a virtue within the colonies that, as one historian suggested, created a unity in the colonies and also a sense of a democratic spirit.
Okay, thank you. So that was very, very helpful. If you'd stay up here as well, and Glenn, I'd like for you to respond. Which one of the points that Gene raised would you like to respond to initially?
I got two mics here. So.
Oh, we got two mics, so we'll go with there.
I also believe, along with Gene, that the Great Awakening was certainly a factor in developing that foundation. But the Great Awakening also created a lot of division and disunity in the United States. A lot of established churches were split in half, the old lights and the new lights. A lot of conflict came out of that. And I think that in 1774, when the First Continental Congress was actually wrestling with how we're going to unify the people enough so that we can actually stand against a common enemy, one of the things that they were wanting to address was unity. And getting people to give up those things that would tie them to the mother country, giving up those things that would give them a sense of character, would bring about that unity as well as the virtue.
Okay, I'll take that. So, somebody have a question you'd like to add to the conversation as we develop this dialogue? We got a question back here. Would you state your name and your question?
Derek Brown. Around that time, the Quakers in Philadelphia were very big into simple clothing, simple furniture, simple homes, but they also really loved nice carriages, 7-course meals. So their virtue had some loopholes. And as I thought about what loopholes existed in what you were talking about, I wondered if there were also loopholes in the legislative virtue, and I answered my own question really sadly, which was slavery. And the question I have is, do you think that the virtue sort of legislated was undermined because of the existence of slavery? Meaning, can these minor virtues not succeed where great injustice prevails? And what does that teach us today about our society?
One of the things that would have been necessary to have given the 13 colonies that kind of cohesion or unity would be putting slavery aside. Now, you recall that Thomas Jefferson wrote the abolition of slavery into the Declaration of Independence, but when it went back to Congress, it was removed in order to keep the southern states in line with the northern states. And all along, all of the legislation, even up until we come to the Civil War, that question of slavery is always one that becomes very divisive. So I think in 1774, that First Continental Congress was attempting to find ways of, again, creating unity, but they weren't necessarily creating every virtuous way to do it. And I don't think that slavery became a major issue at all in that process. You'll also have to remember that slavery was still an active institution in Great Britain when the Revolution began.
Okay, Gene, any comment or?
Just a comment, as Derek's pointed out, some of the testimonies, the early Quakers actually became legalistic as time went on. The plain clothing, gray clothing, many found that gray clothing had to be fine linen and so on, so it wasn't so simple anymore. The use of thee and thou was outdated, is anachronistic after a time, because by the time, in the 1800s, everybody was using you with everybody else. It wasn't just for the dignitaries and so on, as it was in the time of George Fox, when they used the more simple thee and thou in order not to instill pride in the dignitaries. So that's the danger too. Virtue, if it's not cultivated, because it's being transformed to the image of Christ, can easily become legalism.
Any other question, question? This student? No. Oh, okay. No, I don't think. Was there a student? RL? Okay, go ahead.
Do you see William Penn's holy experiment to give freedom to all persons living in the United States who would come to Pennsylvania as a source of unity, all living with the same equal opportunities? What would you say about that, Glenn?
Even though that noble experiment of William Penn was designed to give equal opportunity for anyone with any religious belief, it soon found that there was not that perfect union among the people in Pennsylvania. Some came to rebel against the absentee proprietorship of William, but there was, before the actual letting go of the colony by the Friends, there was a lot of disunion between those who were not Friends and those who were. It seemed like the great experiment in that essence really failed. I don't know how else to answer it. Just people don't get along together that well unless they are working at creating virtue and character, and not everyone in Pennsylvania was at that point in time.
I won't speak directly to your question, but I'm reminded of something one of my professors said about Philadelphia, seeing all the nice houses that the Quakers had built. He said, Quakers came to Pennsylvania to do good and ended up doing very well.
Okay, we have time for one more question. Do one of you students have? Yes, here we are. Here's an aspiring theologian, historian.
So how does this look like today in our nation? Because right now it seems we are very politically charged, and it seems kind of tense in our country right now with all the differing ideas and what's going on. So how do we be virtuous today? Like, are there ways that we can see that we're being virtuous? Or I don't know if that makes sense, but like, in what ways are we being virtuous right now, or in what ways do we need to be better?
Well, that's a really difficult question to answer because, as Gene pointed out, you really cannot legislate virtue. It's got to be something that comes from within. It's got to be a habit. It's got to be something that you build your life upon. The 1774 action by that First Continental Congress was not completely accepted all across 13 colonies, because there were a certain number of people that remained loyal, who didn't look for a revolution, who wanted to maintain their roots with Great Britain. And in fact, it's kind of ironic that Samuel Galloway, who brought the proposal to the Congress, during the war itself remained a loyalist and fought with the British, and became the civil administrator of the city of Philadelphia, who was very much opposed to the Friends of that city during the Revolution itself. We know that you cannot really legislate virtue today. The best thing we can do is to inculcate it, to make it part of the program, whatever it is, to live it out among people, to put it on the shoulders of the church, to be examples, exemplary examples of that virtue. And unfortunately, you cannot just make a decision to say, from this point on, this is all going to be something that's illegal. You've got to give them a better example to follow what is right.
Thinking when I read Glenn's paper and then thinking about virtue and how it's developed and so on, I was reminded of some studies done by Lawrence Kohlberg on development of character, so on, and he states that every individual goes through stages. At the youngest stage, you do or don't do something because your parents say no, or okay, or they commend that. The second stage, you do or don't do something because you're afraid of getting caught. And then there's a stage where peer pressure enters in and you act according to peer pressure and what society expects and so on. The highest level is the level of principle. When you really understand why something ought to be done or ought not to be done. And a lot of people don't ever get to that level. But the greatest hope is for Christians, because Christians, through the reading of the Word and the leading of the Holy Spirit, can come to that point where they understand the principle behind it. It's not just legislated, this is wrong, don't do it, and so on, but because they understand the harm of doing it and so on. And so again, our greatest hope is another great awakening, I think. We need to pray for that, pray that the Spirit will move among us as a nation.
Let's give our two presenters another round of applause. Well, I want to thank you all for coming, and for those of you who are viewing. And we are doing this to continue to encourage research and the work of the people of this institution, so that we can further the critical questions that hit us today. So have a great rest of the evening. There are some cookies and some punch out there, so